From here, I forgot we have, let's just stand someplace, or is it not?
If you want to stand in front of the.
Wow.
On the other side.
Oh, I got
it right here where I am.
Like literally, that's where the camera is.
Sorry.
Well, the good news is this is the last time we'll probably have an event in this space because we have a new big space. And so we won't have to always be sitting on top of each other with sunshine right in our eyes. So thank you for being here, for making time for yourself. I am Vicky. I'm one of the owners of Angel Whispers, and I welcome you. And tonight we're excited because we have Nathan, who's going to be presenting, who is a hospital chaplain. I'm going to let Nathan explain everything about what he does, but this is an exciting partnership and the first of many times we do stuff like this together. Because he's one of our healers that's going to be moving over to the big space with us. So we're really excited about that. But I'm just going to open with a blessing because I think it's important for us to kind of just invite in spirit. Thank you, Creator, for bringing each person here and for allowing us to put our guard down and to be vulnerable and to recognize that this is a safe space where healing takes place. So whatever it is that each person needs, you know that. And we invite that comfort level here so that they can cry if they need to, laugh if they need to, squirm if they need to, whatever it is that their body and soul is calling for tonight. Help us to provide that safe space for it. So bless this time. Let Nathan's words be ones of healing to the souls of each person here. We thank you and we give you all the praise. Amen.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. And welcome to everybody online. As we do love this session of Loving Yourself Through Grief, just wanted to give you a little background. For over 20 years, I worked in spiritual care in different spaces, whether it's in congregational spaces or then eventually in the critical care space in hospitals. Most recently, I was the lead palliative care chaplain for a large 700-bed level 1 trauma hospital in Detroit. And now I work for a hospice agency. And with all of that, there's the common thread, especially in recent years, really working with people who are navigating grief and traumatic loss and death losses and non-death losses. There's lots of different ways we encounter grief in our lives. And especially now with hospice, I get to sit at bedside with patients and their families as people are preparing themselves for their inevitable end, as well as the families that continue on and navigating the initial days of bereavement and grief. And so for me, grief is a very important thing to me, not only because of the nature of my work, but also like many of you, I've suffered greatly through some losses, and some of us here today online or with us today have recent losses. Some of us have losses we've been navigating for years. Every single one of us has a different kind of grief story. And so my hope is in our time together that we get tools to really understand ourselves and to understand what's actually happening in the grief process and really get language to understand how grief is impacting us. Because I'm a really firm believer that no one is an expert in anyone else's experience, right? You are the expert in your story. And so whatever training and expertise or information I bring today, I want it to support your journey and your healing and your growth through grief, because I believe that grief actually, the way it actually unfolds and what it is an opportunity for us to grow and become whole, even though that might be hard for some of you to believe tonight. Whether you're a person of a lot of faith or little faith or no faith at all, I think, especially for those of you who might be feeling like, I don't really see a way through grief. I'm very overwhelmed by the losses I'm navigating. I don't know how to do this. I don't know if I want to do this. Those are all things some of us have maybe experienced at times. If you're in that place where you just kind of feel stuck, you know, regardless of what your religious or spiritual background is, I think the heart behind some of what we're going to do today by trusting each other in this space is really exemplified in a Jesus story There's a story in the Gospels where Jesus has gone out and traveled and been healing and teaching and caring for people. And then he comes home and he's tired. He's been out on the road. It's like when you get back and you want to do your laundry and, get in your night PJs from your day PJs, right? And put your feet up and watch Netflix and eat a pizza, or something, right? And the whole town comes out because Jesus is back, and they come to his house and they fill his house and they're wanting more healing and they're wanting more teaching and they're wanting more care. And there's a person who's really sick and he can't get to Jesus. So his friends go up and carry him up and rip the roof open of Jesus's house. And, imagine having your roof, you're trying to rest and everybody's in your house. And then some crazy people rip your roof open and they shove this guy in Jesus's face. They lower him down. And the really powerful thing about that story is they don't record any actual conversation happening other than what Jesus says to the man when he heals him. But the line before it is it says he sees their faith, meaning the people looking down through the roof, and then he heals the man in front of him. And so if you're stuck today, if you're not really sure how to make your way through grief, that's okay. In this space, we'll be up on the roof and we'll have the faith for you. And we'll just give you the tools today. And when you're ready to take them up, you can. Make sense? Good. So let's start. Earl Grolman is a writer and a thinker who says grief. Let me get here. Technology is loving me today already. There, he says grief is not a disorder or a disease or a sign of weakness. It's an emotional, physical, and spiritual necessity. It's the price you pay for love. And the only way through grief is to grieve. And so in this session, I want us to discover your grieving style. We're going to do a little reflection exercise. So if you want to write stuff, there's some journals here and pens when we get to that point. We're going to talk about how grief actually works, the most recent research-based, evidence-based, research-driven understandings of how grief works for people. And then we're going to do a brief survey of the areas of impact of grief, which are physical, emotional, relational, sometimes we call it behavioral, and then spiritual. And then 3 big keys to grief, and we'll end with some question and answer if people are ready to do that, okay? But before we do all that, we have this awesome blessing from Vicky. Let's also do a brief kind of centering moment where we give ourselves the gift of breath and silence. When we just take a moment to breathe and focus on our breathing, our minds come home to our bodies and we just kind of center down. And so I'd invite you to sit where you are as comfortably as you can, if feet flat on the floor, spine tall and straight, and to simply breathe in and out and in and out and in. We are at home. We are safe. We are loved. We are strong. And we are wise. And we are filled with gratitude for the gift of our sacred presence with each other. Amen. So be it. The first duty of love is to listen, or so says a famous 20th century religious philosopher. And it's easy to see how listening can benefit us, right? And our interactions with others and the people we care about and share life with. But what about really listening to yourself? Listening to yourself. Now, pop psychology and social media influencers and many voices always call us, all the daytime talk shows, right? We talk about heavy things and then it comes back to you got to love yourself, right? We're always being called to love ourselves, right? But what does that really look like, right? It can be good advice, but it's got to mean more than just giving ourselves permission to do things we want and do things we enjoy. Or after a long week at work, you finally say, screw it, I'm gonna buy $300 worth of cute new shoes on Amazon and not feel bad. You know, like what does loving yourself mean really, right? What does loving yourself mean when life breaks down? What does loving yourself mean when you have yet another miscarriage? What does loving yourself mean when you lose that job that was your dream job and gave you a sense of purpose and that's all stripped away? How do you love yourself when the person who said forever says forget it and walks out the door, right? These are all different ways grief impacts us. How do you love yourself and what can you do when you're standing at the graveside of a person you don't know how you're going to live without? How do you love yourself through grief? Well, you listen. You listen, you pay acute attention to yourself because you are worthy of your own attention. You're worthy of your own attention. So you listen. And you listen to your grief to love yourself through grief. You love yourself through grief because love is the only way really through anything. Love is the way forward. We don't move on from grief. We move forward with our grief. We grow around our grief. We'll talk about in a minute. So you listen and you honor yourself. You honor yourself this way, especially when no one else can or will. You have to honor yourself because you are worthy of your own attention. So you listen to your body and you listen to your tears and you listen to your anger and you listen to your exhaustion and you listen to the sleeplessness or the only thing I want to do is sleep all the time. You listen to the way you find yourself searching for the person who is now gone. I remember just 3 years ago when my dad died, we were down in Florida to help my mom with the burial. And like, I found myself that whole first week, every time I went out to do a grocery run for mom or pick up more meds for mom or go pick up something for the florist, right? Everywhere I'm going, driving up and down the road in Naples, I'm looking for my dad, even though I know exactly where he is, right? I'm looking for my dad and I'd see him everywhere and then I'd have to double take and then it wasn't him, right? These are some of the ways that grief manifests itself in us. You listen to the changes in your appetite. You listen to the urge that you have to run away or the urge that you have to stay busy. You listen to the way you're suddenly becoming cognitively, your mind just feels blurry and you're forgetful all the time. You listen to the memories that come flooding in. You listen for maybe the collapse of your faith because you don't understand why God allowed the person you love to go through or you to go through what you're going through. Or you listen to the birth of faith or the rebirth of a kind of faith. You listen to your feelings of guilt. You listen to the relief you might feel. You listen to the anxiety. You listen to all the infinite ways that grief unfolds and roars and weeps in you. And you listen to see how grief can create a whole new way of being you in the world. And I'm really glad that we get to explore this together tonight. And it's important to me, like I said, not only because of the research that drives what I do professionally, but because, like I said, in my own life, I've suffered with grief and just even recently over the course of 50 years of life, but just even recently in 2020, my job was blown up, my community was taken away, my dad died in 2021, my wife was diagnosed with the return of metastatic breast cancer, terminal breast cancer in 2022. And I'm still here and I'm here partly because of the way these tools have helped me. And I'm really hoping they do the same for you. And that knowledge has been one of the keys to just my ongoing journey of growth and love and persistence. And it's helped me to understand the powerful ways that grief can really enlarge our hearts and lead us into deeper wisdom and lead you into a higher capacity for compassion and maybe even joy. So here's a picture of what I mean by growth, okay? And this is called Growing Around Your Grief. It's a model that was described by the work of a woman named Dr. Lois Tonkin. People tend to think that grief shrinks over time, like you're the jar and the grief when it first presents is so big, and then we eventually kind of process it and it gets smaller and smaller. But what really happens, what we've learned is that we grow around our grief. Like the impact of the loss, the disruption is what it is. That does not diminish. It cannot be undone. But as we grow through grief, as we learn to love ourselves through grief, our capacity to integrate it and understand it grows and grows. So it's my hope that our time together fosters that kind of growth. So let's dive in, okay? We're going to talk about grieving styles. Grieving styles. So because you are worthy of your own attention, a great place to start to grow is cultivating an awareness of your style. There was a researcher named Ken Doka who's done a ton of work over the last 20 years or more on grief and the nature of grief and how it unfolds in people. And he's shown us that people largely fall. There's a couple other categories here, but largely people fall into two different styles of grieving: intuitive grieving and instrumental grieving. Intuitive grieving and instrumental grieving. And intuitive grieving is characterized by more of a focus on emotional expression. It's kind of what we culturally is the dominant expected understanding of grief in our culture, right? People cry, you cry, you weep, you're sad, you might not want to eat, you want to sleep, things like that, right? If your primary grieving style is intuitive, you're going to lean toward experiencing and expressing your grief in terms of feelings and seeking emotional support and being inclined more towards talking about loss or crying or other forms of expression. And that style really emphasizes working through the emotional pain associated with loss. And this is very Doka's work, if you ever want to dive deeper and you want to read a more academic book, if you care enough, right? Like Doka even talks about how these reactions are often connected to culture, religion, family, personality, and gender, right? Like our dominant culture tends to expect more intuitive grieving when we experience loss, but we also tend to assign this style of grieving more to women often, even though that's not always the case, right? The other side of it is instrumental grieving. And that's more characterized toward actions and thinking about the situation. People who gravitate toward this style focus on tasks and activities related to the loss process. That could involve organizing memorials or managing the estate of the deceased or calling the funeral home provider, and they immerse themselves in work. So emotional expression may be more internalized with a preference for thinking rather than feeling their way through grief. And neither style is better or right. It just is, right? And everybody is a mix of both. And as we talk about how grief works, you'll see how this plays out a little more. And like I said, it's influenced by your personality, your upbringing, your culture. Everybody does a bit of both, but one tends to dominate. And so like where sometimes I've seen this really expressed, like when I worked in the hospital, a lot of times you'd have a family member who would, upon the loss of their loved one, would suddenly go right into, as I walked in the room, what do I need to do next? Where do I get death certificates? Who do I call, right? And there might be other family members in the room who are just doing kind of classic intuitive grieving characteristics, right? Person by the bed, distraught. There's nothing you can say to me that's going to help me feel better. Leave me alone. Got it. I got you. I will leave you alone. I'm right here. I'll talk with your husband about funeral home process. You know what I mean? Things like that, right? These things all happen. And sometimes when we're in the midst of our grief, it's not only important to recognize our own grieving style, but recognize that there's no wrong way to grieve, which is what thing we'll say later, but like other people are going to be navigating this differently. So like when my dad died, my mom was very instrumental in her grief. So she was very focused on getting everything taken care of and making sure everybody was fed and the luncheon was set up and everything. And I was like climbing the walls, and there was like a part of me that was like, what's wrong with you, Mrs. Robot Woman? Why aren't you sad? And then all this training came back and I was like, oh, I'm living in what I know. We're doing classic instrumental versus intuitive grieving, and it's not a competition. It doesn't mean my mom is dysfunctional. It means this is how she's navigating it. This is how she's processing her grief. So when we have these tools, when we recognize this, we not only become aware of ourselves, but it strengthens our ability to understand what's happening around us and support each other well, So what I'd like to do is just do a brief kind of written exercise. You can use the journals that we have. Which style is yours? Which style is yours? So I invite you to like open up your journal and get out your pen. And we'll do this first part. And I'm gonna throw on a little music. So we can enjoy ourselves a little bit here. So in this first part, just think about a recent loss. How did you find comfort? Was it in expressing emotions or focusing on tasks? Let's just write a one sentence description of the loss and then write down ways you found comfort, maybe bullet statements or something. Style, neat. So. Thank you. It's brave to look at yourself, especially when you're carrying something that's hard. Would anybody, no pressure, but would anybody like to share their grieving style and why they think that is what works well for them? Or even anyone online, and let y'all chat.
I've had a lot of loss, grandparents passing away, and stepdad that passed away, but I've had two really profound losses. And I dealt with them both very differently, and there's 7 years to separate the two of them. The first one, I had not been in therapy. The second one, I'd been in about 6 years of therapy. The first one was trying to have a baby for 10 years and going through the IVF process and failing the IVF process. And the day we found out that we could not try any longer, I shifted into some strange space that I'd never really been in. And it was a loss that was very angry. I just shifted right into the more action oriented. Okay, this is what I just bought a 5-bedroom house. I was gonna fill it with kids. And so I went right to action oriented and really continued on that path for about a year until I had a nervous breakdown, because I stayed in this space of not feeling my feelings and protecting myself from the finality of that and how much grief. And what I was realizing I was grieving was the loss of the life I had imagined.
Yeah.
It was a huge, huge loss that just took me to tackle me. And then I spent a year really, really going through a difficult time, very quietly, privately, being more intuitive, but really not sharing that with people and sort of doing that on my own. And that wasn't great for me either. So started therapy after a really difficult time. And like I said, a true blue nervous breakdown. Went through 7 years of therapy and learned that it was grief. I was grieving. I didn't really see it that way, but really learned what that was. And when I lost my father almost a year and a half ago, that grief looked entirely different. I immediately was soft with myself and I allowed myself to feel my feelings and was very intuitive. But I'm also the manager of his estate, so I also had to be action oriented.
Right.
So I kind of had to balance both. Like, if I feel my feelings, but my sisters are looking for me to like lead the way, move out of his house and take care of all the things. So in writing in the journal, I was like, both? Can I do both?
Yeah, Ken Doka says there's a third style called blended, right? And that's because of circumstance, personality, inner work that you bravely did for a long time, right? So yeah, definitely.
I would just want to say, maybe you can address this at some point, because this is bringing up a lot of interesting questions for myself. But the action-oriented grief for me felt like a lot of denial of feelings, where the intuitive felt like, okay, I'm going to process this in a soft and healthy way. And no judgment on anybody's style, but that's what it felt like for me.
Yeah, totally. We can, and the next part, we'll be talking about how grief works. We'll get into some of that as well. So that's great. Thank you for
But
sharing.
just to your point too, the loving yourself. So I spent 6 years learning to really love myself.
Right.
So that made that profound loss of my dad a lot easier. So that's why I'm here too, is just to kind of,
That's awesome.
Hear more about that.
Yeah, totally. Anyone else?
Segue on that, as you were explaining it, sorry, the sun is right here, right?
Sorry.
That's like, I want you to talk. I was just like, I'm both, like, how do you be? So that was part of what I'm consistent, I'm still both. One is bigger than the other, and I carry them both most days in some form and at certain times of the day. And where you were saying the instrumental was kind of denial, and I can see that in some aspects, but what I was recognizing, because I was putting myself down, I've learned to listen to myself and recognize what's going on. But I've also learned that there's so many things you can't control. Yes. And this is the hardest emotion I've ever had in my life. I lost my husband. It'll be a year next month. When I was doing the instrumental, I still felt, but I would address the feelings and make myself feel stronger so that I could do the instrumental. Because those were necessities. And I have a
Yes.
21 and a 24-year-old who were both living at home all the time. And so if I could make certain changes, but keep certain things the same, if I could balance holidays and do all of that, like that instrumental was actually quite healing for
Yes.
everyone. So that's why I was like, how can you be both? I mean, and one, looking at your jars, I was like, one's this big one day and one's this big. Like, I may not cry that day,
Mhm.
but then the next day I'm
Mhm.
sobbing at everything. And
Yeah.
it's like, where did that come from? I thought I was moving forward. And so one of the,
Oh,
and I'm constantly grabbing resources and Vicky and everything else. And it's like, grief is not linear.
Nope.
Just because you're crying that day,
Right,
you don't get through
it
it.
doesn't run in a straight line, yeah.
Right, so it
absolutely.
doesn't mean I'm going backwards. It
Right.
means I'm going forward still. And maybe there still will be a day that I don't cry. I mean.
Yeah. Yeah,
But learning to, it's okay to
Yeah.
not be okay.
I'm getting chills because this is like grief gold and this is a great segue, unless somebody else really wants to share into the next section, because it will illuminate further kind of what we're talking about. Does that sound good? Yeah,
We brought
Wait.
grief gold.
yeah,
That's-
yeah. Two comments from online. What are those? You want to read them?
Jackie says, hi all, I appreciate knowing that we can float in styles. When her son died, and she spent quite some time in intuitive grief and then flipped into instrumental grieving to get through everything we needed to do. Now that they're a year down the road, she finds herself more on the intuitive end of grief. And it's freeing to allow herself to feel the emotion of the moment.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Jackie.
Carrie says, I definitely float between both styles. I think I lean towards instrumental because it's easier for me than facing the emotions.
Fascinating. Thank you, Carrie. Yeah. So,
Sorry. to
Yeah,
really
go ahead.
add on that, is I felt like if I was only dealing with the intuitive sense and not getting things done, that I
yeah.
was weak. Like I
Uh,
felt like, oh, it's all about me and my feelings and how sad I am and I'm working through all that. But there's still all these things that have to get done. So if I went through a day and only did one load of laundry and made dinner, I was not sufficient.
interesting.
So I had to work through trying to make a balance, and it's not what
Huh.
you're worth.
Yeah.
You're worth more,
Yeah.
and you need to address whatever's really going on, not what you're doing.
This is really good because I'm hearing like the thread that is in our culture is that we tend to make a value statement about how we're doing our grief, right? Like we tend to make value statements about how people are handling grief. Like, one of the things that like, because we're a very death avoidant, discomfort avoidant culture, right? So like one of the things I really, really sometimes just personally gets my hackles up is like when you meet someone who's, has lost someone and they're connecting with the person and they're kind of in this kind of like even space. And then when they walk away, someone says, gosh, Boo Boo just seems to be doing so well. And what that oftentimes is code for in our culture is, gosh, we're so happy she's acting like there's never any loss, like because we're uncomfortable with your feelings or whatever, you know what I mean? And so like this, let's step into this part of the conversation, the how the grief works, like what we've started to learn, because I think this will help illuminate even more, and you'll be able to automatically make connections between your personal grieving styles, as well as then how we understand what the best thinking right now about how grief actually works from a clinical standpoint in our research. Okay. So in our popular cultural imagination, right? Most of us think intuitively of grief in terms of the stages of grief that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross created and published in 1969. Okay. Whether you know that name or not, we talk about the stages of grief. And she proposed that those stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then acceptance. Okay. And we are all indebted to Kubler-Ross because she broke open a conversation in a death avoidant culture that doesn't want to talk about grief. It's not fun because grief is uncomfortable anyway, but generally in a culture that didn't know how to talk about it, she gave us these awesome conversational handholds to give us permission to start talking about it. Now, not at my hospice agency, but I have colleagues who work at other hospice agencies where these stages of grief are actually embedded into the electronic medical record. And you have to like say where you think the patient and their family is on this. This is the thing. as much as Stages of Grief has captured our cultural imagination and was really important for us, what we've learned is that her work was being adapted to talk about grief of survivors or people who have experienced loss, when in reality, she was going around and interviewing people who were in the process of dying themselves. And it wasn't a formalized like research structure. So it was very anecdotal. Like she'd ask one person one question, but then she'd ask another person 10 questions. And it wasn't structured enough to really frame out accurately how grief is actually working. And later on, closer to the end of her life, she had expressed publicly regret that it had even been talked about as stages of grief, because it's not really where we've learned where it works. So part of the challenge here is also that researchers find that the stages of grief set up grieving to be on a linear line in our imagination, right? They imply a kind of up and to the right kind of capitalist profit view, right? We're going to go up and to the right and we're going to achieve acceptance. And then I will be okay and I will be healthy. And everyone will say, gosh, Tanya's doing so good because she just seems to be doing so well because she's not acting like she's lost anyone anymore, right? Or whatever it is, right? So like we know, what we've learned in 60 years since Kubler-Ross, grief doesn't go in a straight line, and we tend to judge ourselves or even others if we don't feel like they're progressing and processing through their grief at a satisfactory pace, whatever that means, right? We have as human beings this weird need to judge ourselves. You know, I mean, never mind how we judge everyone else. We judge ourselves, right? And research just confirms that you can't put grief on a schedule. You can't put grief on a schedule. And it also shows us too that when people moralize or criticize the grieving process that someone's doing, it makes it harder for that person to then grow around their grief or to integrate their loss or to move forward even. So lots of other task and stage models have been proposed since then, but about 20 years ago, and now consistently through the last 20 years, a group of Swedish researchers realized that when we observe how grief is unfolding, it generally is better to be described as a dual process model. So before we get into that, right, stages of grief are great because they normalize grief talk for us. But the dual process model says that grief oscillates from what's called a loss orientation to a restoration orientation. And it kind of poked holes that, like, there's a thing called the grief work hypothesis, which means basically the central commitment is if you are grieving, to grieve well and correctly, you must face your grief and name it and push into it. Otherwise, you're in denial, right? But what the researchers of the dual process model have understood is that actually you can't just keep facing stuff. You need a break. Just like your body can't run 2 marathons back to back, your body cannot just be in the marathon of grief all the time. Literally your body, not just your mind, but your body can't just do grief all the time. You need respite. You need rest. There's an actual healthy role in grief for distraction. There's an actual healthy role in doses for avoidance, right? So this is what they talk about. Loss orientation versus restoration orientation. And it's not on a perfect wave form, right? Grief and loss comes into your life. You're sad, you're upset, you go home, you throw something, you go to bed, but you don't want to eat, right? And you're there for a while, and other people are bringing your community comes around you maybe and starts bringing you food and all these things. And then you realize after a few days, I still got to do the laundry. Like, or if you've lost your partner, right? Like, my partner used to mow the lawn, and the lawn's really long now, but they're gone. I got to learn how to mow the lawn. That's actually a restoration orientation expression of grief. You're learning how to do life, the new realities of life that are not necessarily all intuitive in their expression, right? They're not focusing on the loss itself, but on the how do I move forward? How do I still do the normal things? Those are, and I got to go get groceries, right? And I need to get out of the house because I've been in the house crying in the same clothes for 2 weeks. So you take a shower and you get in the car and you're headed out to Meijer, and you get to the corner of Jackson and Zeeb right down there. And all of a sudden the song that was playing the day you met your loved one comes on the radio, and you're just bawling as you pull into the Meijer parking lot, right? You're back into loss orientation, and you kind of pull it together. Or, there have been times that maybe people at the local Meijer has maybe seen someone standing in the pasta aisle just crying, looking at all the pasta sauces and just crying, and waiting for someone to say, do you need help? And just say something like, it's just overwhelming. There's too many choices. You know what I mean? But like, you can go back and forth between loss orientation into restoration orientation. And one of the things that I love about this model is that it is about just observing what is actually happening without any judgment, without any value statements, right? It's helped me so much. So that way, when I'm driving down the road home from work, and all of a sudden, for no reason, I'm flooded with those feelings of loss and frustration and anger at the different ways that I'm grieving, and I'm suddenly howling in the car. This has helped me go, oh, I'm not losing my mind, right? I'm just being a normal person who's grieving the way grief unfolds for me, right? I love the dual process model. It kind of invites us to stop judging ourselves or putting ourselves on a schedule. It just helps us recognize what's happening and to listen to ourselves. And that's the essence of loving ourselves through our grief, right? So let me see here. So like I'd said, rest and avoidance and distraction are actually healthy parts in doses, right, of this unfolding process of grief, because you're relearning how to live again in the wake of loss, and you're normalizing your new situation when you go into restoration situation. And what this helps us understand is the second key for me, which is there's no wrong way to grieve. There's no wrong way to grieve. When I was working at the height of pandemic at a level 1 trauma hospital in the ICU, the medical ICU, that's the sickest of the sick people. Anybody who came from any other COVID ward would come into my ICU. And if you came to my ICU that year, you didn't leave alive. Every single one of my patients died. And sometimes we'd have 6, 7 deaths by noon, And I would say to every single family, there's no wrong way to do today. There's no wrong way to do today, because there's no wrong way to grieve. There's no wrong way to grieve. You have to let the process unfold. And, there's no wrong way to do today, and there's no wrong way to do your grief tomorrow, and there's no wrong way to do your grief in a month. There's no wrong way to do today, And hearing people give each other permission in that way validates our grief in ways that are healing and helps us pay attention to ourselves and give ourselves the honor that we need, So that way you can just stop judging yourself. Don't put yourself on the schedule. Don't let anyone else put you on a grief schedule. And don't ever give yourselves messages like, well, I should be over this by now. Says who? Says who? Or I need to get myself together. Or as my mother likes to say, where's that written? Where's that written? Because that wasn't on the tablets on Mount Sinai with Moses. There's no, thou shalt get thyself together. That's just not how it works. It's not how it works. So that's the dual process model of grief. Any questions before we move on to other areas? Thoughts? How does this impact you, Tanya?
Oh, I just wanna, we're talking about how, like, for us going through the grieving process, but we touch on like those that are trying to support us. So like my example is, I get this, and I can relate to what both of you guys said,
Yeah.
in my own grief. And I lean towards being the action oriented. And I find this time that I'm going through loss of my father recently, the things that kept me busy before, that I had to just jump in. My kids were younger, or I had to take care of my dad, or jump into the family business, to keep things moving. I don't have those things to keep me busy, that I'm finding myself lost more.
Mm,
But I'm also finding my husband is lost of how to help me
mhm,
through my grief.
mhm.
And
Yeah,
when he sees me upset or crying, or like a perfect example is one time, like after I lost my mom, we put in a video
mhm.
of our wedding and my mom came on and I just started crying. So he wanted to turn it off
Mm.
because he felt that I was upset because of that. And I said, let me cry, like it's
Mhm.
healing. So
Yeah,
does it make sense? Like
totally.
on not just helping us,
Yeah,
but you know,
absolutely.
how to relate it to other people so they can understand what we're
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a way to probably do this workshop as loving others through their grief as well, right? You know, I think it's really awesome that you're able to have the openness of communication with him to be able to say, no, it's good. Because like that's part of helping people help us in that is communicating clearly where we are. So at least there's openness there to that. And it's not wrong to be like, I want to preserve my loved one from pain, right? You know what I mean? That's a very natural reaction. That's a normal human reaction. Like, we should turn it off, right? Yeah, you know, so right. And like, and that it'd be easy for people to say, well, that's about him and his discomfort. Well, I'm not interested in judging your husband's discomfort if that's there or not. We can't excavate his interior geology and judge him, right? He's just doing what a person who loves you would want to do, which is protect you from pain, right? You know what I mean? So part of the helping is already you're doing it, right? By saying, no, I need to. It's okay, right? It's okay, right? I need this. And communicating your needs. I think also too, you know, when we talk about disrupted emotional needs or thwarted emotional needs, really powerful questions that we need to be able to ask people is where does it hurt? And how can I help? You know?
Because one thing you said earlier is like how we were raised or how we were growing up, and I was raised in a home where you suppressed your emotions,
Mm,
right? Like, you know, I lost my best friend in high school, but I didn't get to
mm,
spend time crying over it. It's like, okay,
mhm.
put yourself together, you know, like,
Right,
let's move on,
right.
you know, so like, I think that has a lot to do with it either, is to do with me personally, it's not trying to hide those
Yeah.
emotions, but then letting them out and feeling comfortable
Right.
doing that.
Right. And to also, you know, understand that the family of origin that communicated certain messages about grief, right? Were doing the best they could with the desire to be like, hey, so because there are moments in our life where sometimes, you know, like when I went through a really difficult situation many years ago, I remember my dad just looking right at me and being like, that was terrible, but you need to go out and get a job. Right? Like you need to get back up on the horse and go do it. And you do need people who can do that, right? You know what I mean? So in theory, right, in abstract, many of these moves have benefit to them, right? It's just understanding that maybe that's not working or what you need in that moment, right? And you being the person who guides your grief process, right?
Well, and that's
So-
what I wanted to share, because so many people, like my husband, they just wanna fix it, they wanna help you. And it's such a
Yeah.
difficult trait to have,
Right,
but then I was finally able to say to a number of people, I'm like, I appreciate all you're doing, just being here, take the burden off yourself, you can't fix it.
right,
I'm working on it, the kids are doing good,
Right.
we're working on it. I promise you, I'll let you know if I need anything,
right.
but there is absolutely, if there was something you could do to fix it, that would be amazing.
You could
But there's
bottle,
not.
yeah, right. If you could fix it,
There's
you'd bottle it up and you'd be the richest person in the world. You know what I
They
mean?
felt uncomfortable or burdened thinking, I'm gonna fix this, I'm gonna fix this. and
Right,
You can't.
right.
And so it was almost more comfortable to have conversations and just kind of be more quotes normal around each other.
Mm,
Where they weren't feeling like, what can I do to help, or what can I?
right,
You can't,
right.
just be there. Or
Yes,
talk on the phone. and just
yes.
be- It's really that simple.
It really is. It really is. Yes, Kathy.
I have a lot of people that I have to take care of.
Mhm.
And I'm pretty tapped out,
Mm,
and everyone
everyone keeps telling me to take care of myself,
Mm,
but that makes me be strong because they need you.
mhm.
And I don't know, I can't know.
Yeah, yeah. No, don't apologize. Don't apologize. That's,
People to take care of
yeah. And you feel like the instructions to move towards self-care,
me, but
it's not happening.
bad things that have been happening,
Yeah.
really bad things, and
Mm,
it's been really bad
oh, sorry.
for a long time. Yeah.
Sounds exhausting. I hear your soul is tired. I hear
Mom
that.
is 95. She's pretty awesome, and I don't wanna throw her
Oh.
under the bus, but she always, and she's wonderful, but she's, be strong, Larry needs you, Larry, no, Larry's, I had 2 Larrys, they need me,
Mm, mm,
and everything was just falling apart,
yeah,
sorry.
no, it's
Don't
okay.
apologize.
You don't, guys. You honor us with your vulnerability. This is just a holy moment.
It's hard for us to care for
Yeah,
ourselves.
it is. It really is.
Especially when you're a caregiver,
Yes.
because, you know,
So
you feel selfish if you do even the smallest thing.
I feel like I'm a burden.
you're not, you know. Let's just take a moment. Let's just take a moment and pause. And if you're watching online, we have someone sharing very vulnerably right now. They're tired and exhausted and they care for a lot of people that are counting on them. And they don't know how they're gonna find margin to do self-care in any way. And she's sharing very vulnerably. And so like, I just like us to just maybe let's just push pause for a minute and let's just move into silence. And I'd like everybody to just kind of direct their intention of like care and love toward Kathy, even if you're online. There's a sweet lady named Kathy here who's in pain. And let's just take a minute to breathe and just, as Jill likes to say, let's just send her love. Let's just send her love. Hmm. We see you. We believe you. Thank you, Kathy. And I know, after this, after our time together, I know Vicky, myself, any of us here are more than available to keep talking and chatting with you or anyone who needs to process some more, okay? So, thank you so much. I'm really glad you shared. So let's move to our final section of areas of impact, okay? Areas of impact. We're going to wrap up with just a quick survey of these 4 areas. So research shows us that a lot of the grief work theory and grief theory really started about 100 years ago with the big daddy, Sigmund Freud, right? And he argued that the primary way to process grief is by learning how to break, psychologically and emotionally break your connection to the one you have lost. And he made up a fancy word, decathexis, and said, everybody needs to do decathexis. And what became clear in his private letters is in his own loss, he was able to clearly say in private letters to other people, yeah, that doesn't work. It's never worked for me. I can't do it. I can't do it, which probably means nobody can, you know what I mean? So in the subsequent 100 years, most of grief work and grief theory was developed by psychologists and people who understood family systems and attachment theories and all those things. That's very important for us as we learn about grief, right? But now in the last 20 to 30 years, we also are having neuroscience come into play. We're doing MRI imaging around grief and things, and we're learning that grief actually restructures our neurological anatomy, the structures of our brains. There is a biology that is happening in grief for us. And then that manifests out in different ways in our person. So when we identify areas of impacts, what we're doing is trying to give us quick snapshots to give us an imagination for transformation, right? A new imagination about how to understand the pervasive ways that grief is specifically impacting us in these different dimensions of what it means to be a person, right? So in the physical dimension, we see obviously fatigue or sleep disturbances, right? Insomnia or oversleeping. We see changes in appetite, plus or minus, right? I can tell you for sure, I have been eating my feelings for the last 36 months. I'm a lot heavier than I was when Dad went, okay? And then that compounds other challenges for me, right? Sometimes you'll have physical pain, you'll have headaches or stomach aches, or sometimes, like you haven't been doing anything and all of a sudden you just feel like you have the flu and you don't, you just have muscle and joint pain and you're like, that's sometimes grief. Sometimes you'll have a weakened immune system. Emotionally, you'll experience all those intuitive characteristics, right? Sadness, anger, guilt, anxiety, maybe numbness, feelings of isolation, feelings of overwhelm, right? A whole other thing that we could talk about some other time is like when I work in hospice, my administrator at our branch office is very good about saying when talking with family members, she doesn't refer to the patient as their loved one because we don't know the dynamics of the relationship. Some people emotionally as grief feel relieved and not just the kind of like, it's so good they're not suffering anymore. Some of us are like, I had a conflicted relationship with you for 60 years. You were never good to me. And then you made me care for you at great cost for another 10 at the end. I'm kind of mad at you, and I'm kind of relieved this is over, right? Those are real emotions that we need to validate and not judge in how grief can be expressed. Behavioral or social, we can withdraw from social activities. We can see changes in relationships. We can see decreased concentration and focus. Maybe we start neglecting of our personal care, or maybe changes in your work or school performance, right? A lot of times we see this with kids. Kids are actually pretty resilient around grief. They all manifest different expressions of grief based on their developmental stage. But sometimes, if you have a high performing kid who's pretty put together and seems to be navigating emotionally the loss really well, but all of a sudden their grades tank, that's not because they're doing anything wrong. It's because grief is getting in the way, right? And then spirituality, right? We can start questioning faith or beliefs that we were given. We can start seeking more and deeper or different spiritual connections. We can have feelings of emptiness and meaninglessness, or we get a renewed search for meaning, or a strengthened or renewed sense of belief and faith or spirituality. Or we can have significant upending of our personal values and perspective. Our life stance may completely change through our grief. These are just some of the ways that so when we understand our own grieving style, right? The key thing though here is in learning these things, right, is to learn how it's actually uniquely manifesting in us, in our bodies, in our interior world, in our social world, and to be able to have language then to express that. So you can then go and share your story. You can go and find the people who can support you, right? And it's okay to have different people in your life with different kinds of support, right? Because everyone has a different capacity. So, but I think of what is it? And it's some indigenous religious systems and native systems, shaman teaching, and with Native Americans in America, they'll ask when a person comes to the medicine person in their tribe and they'll say, I'm sick. And a lot of certain tribes, the medicine people, the shaman will say, well, when's the last time you sang? When's the last time you danced? When's the last time you told your story? When's the last time you told? We're storying people, we're narrating people. And when we look at these 4 areas and we see it, we get language to better tell our story with more specificity, right? Because pain, generalization, it perpetuates pain. But specificity, when we get granular, today I'm feeling like crap and it's coming out this way for me, and it's this, and I don't even know if I believe in God anymore, and my body hurts, and I've just been eating double stuffed Oreos all day, right? That's a much more potent story that your helpers as well as yourself. That in itself, language can be an act of self-care. Telling your story clearly and specifically can be a way to care for yourself. So you need to find your people and you tell your story. Find your people. That's part of what this is, even for this brief 90 minutes, right? These are your people. And we've been telling our stories today, and there's healing in that. It helps you normalize talking about grief. So let me finish with this. Identifying your grief style, understanding how grief works, and identifying the way grief specifically impacts you. I know and believe that in the long run, it will empower you to heal and grow and love yourself through grief. As we wrap up, before we take some questions, everyone who participated tonight live or online is going to get a free digital workbook from us so that you can go through some of this material again. It's kind of a focused thing about grief styles, how grief works, and then physical areas with exercises for all three of those components. So exercises that you can return to and use over and over and over again. So it's a reusable tool, as high reuse for you, has exercises and strategies for growth. And then also for everyone who's attended, whether virtual or in person, I'm going to be offering a free one-to-one Love Yourself through Grief session for anyone who wants it, who participated tonight. So if you want to go deeper or explore other areas of your grief, I want to support you in your healing and growth. And I know Vicky does, and the whole team here at Angel Whispers, like one of the things here, like when I take individuals through, like we'll do a deep dive one session on just physical impacts, right? We'll do deep dive review of each one in one session alone, right? So like there's a process that we go through together. And it's been a lot of information, and you guys have been amazing and brave and vulnerable, and I'm so glad you're here tonight. Thank you for coming online as well as here. So if there's anything that you take away, right, it's the three big keys for me, right? Which is you are in your grief process, you are worthy of your own attention. There is no wrong way to grieve on any given day, right? And find your people and tell your story. Okay. So thanks for the gift of your presence tonight. So let's take some questions. Sound good? And what time is it? We have 30 minutes if we want for questions, or if you're done and you guys all want to just go get a drink at Grotto across the street, let's do that too. So
Question. but
Yeah.
I just wanted to respond to the two ones that happened. The first one, I don't know the name. Tanya, I'm Jen. I've gotten really good at training my people, especially my husband, in those moments when, say, the video is playing or there might be something that comes up for me and having them say, how can I show up for you in this moment? Each time is sort of different. And so my husband's kind of almost like a little textbook right now, and it'll get easier for him. But if I'm having a moment, last night I had one, because what Nathan mentioned in the beginning of this is you have these days where you forget that this person is not on the earth anymore. You're just like, what? This is so weird. My dad it's so strange to be on earth without your parent. It's just a strange thing. And last night, out of nowhere, I don't know if I was preparing for today or what, but I've been really good about not having those moments. So he just paired it back. How can I show up for you in this moment? And I just said, I think I just need a hug. And he gave the hug because he is very unsure. What do I do? Do we dive deep on this? Do you need to talk about it? Do you want a hug? And so kind of training and my sister's finally coming around to that too. We're having the same grief, but very different styles of grieving. And then for Kathy, my mom was a caretaker. Her spouse was dying for 15 years, and the tell your story, find your people. I think a support group, caretaking is its own grief. And a support group would do wonders. Even more so, I think, than therapy, because I think you can find commonality and identity with others who are going through the same type of thing, not the exact
Yes.
thing, but I don't know if Nathan has any resources for those support groups or hospitals that offer it. I know a lot of hospitals do, and that's what my
Yeah.
mom did.
Yeah, there's a lot out there, and I even run some, you know, and you can also do kind of more intermittent episodic ones, you know, like on the 3rd anniversary of my dad's death was March 2nd. And for whatever reason, this year it was a lot for me. And we went up to the graveside on the west side of the state. We came back home in the evening, and Jen and her husband and a couple other friends, we all just went to dinner. All of us have lost our dads. And we all sat at dinner and we all ordered our dad's favorite drink. And we all had, you know, and some of them were weird. Like my dad liked an amaretto stone sour. It was weird. It's like a college girl drink, you know, but that he thought was very classy. And so we ordered, you know, it's rot gut, you know, it's just so gross, you know. And so like we all ordered our dad's favorite drinks and we ordered good food. And then we all just sat around and we just talked about our dad's dying processes. We talked about who our dads were. We talked about stories with our dads, you know, and we weren't gonna, you know, we might do that again some other year, but it's like, you know, depending on your needs, you can have grief groups that meet for 3 to 4 sessions or the course of a couple months, or maybe just grab a couple people that you know either have the same experience or will understand and know what you need and be like, hey, we're gonna go stuff our faces with good food and talk about people we love, you know? Yeah, so there's lots of ways. That's really good.
The
That's right.
impromptu moment, like the dinner was magical, like it wasn't.
It
it's not like
was.
all there, "Oh, is this okay? Should I be, you know, am I?
Yeah,
Yes, your dad died too, even though it was a decade ago, and he felt just as connected to the whole.
Yeah.
moment, and those some of us, the rest of us
Yeah.
are more fresh for you.
Mhm.
And, so.
Yeah.
Or something more, you know, decided, like joining a support group
yeah,
and being more intentional about it.
yeah,
I think you can find magic in finding your people and
that's
finding
really good.
people who are similar to what, or going through something similar.
That's really
That
good.
was the kindest and most comforting thing I received after losing my husband, and I had to get my hair cut. And I had like agoraphobia. I couldn't leave the house. I had a lot of anxiety. I've come very far in that regard. But I went and my hairdresser came over, laid her hands on my shoulders, and she said, how can I show up for you?
Mm,
And sometimes
it's like,
touch is really great.
Rachel, like, I can't even tell you how much that means, because it's not like, how are you feeling? Are you okay today? Like,
Yeah.
it was like, how can I show up? Do you want to talk about normal things? Do you want to just pretend this is a regular visit? Do you want to sit quietly? Like, I was like, oh my God, like it was so
Yeah.
genuine. I was
yeah,
like, I have to remember that.
yeah,
Because I felt so cared for, loved. And it was just the simplicity.
Yeah, to feel seen, but also to be able to custom tailor that moment, because like Nathan said, each day, each moment, especially in the initial impact of grief, is different. So you may want to deep dive in that moment, or you may want to, you know, just say, no, I don't want to, I just want to hug and thanks for that, and let's move forward.
Right, she allowed me to enjoy that. Yeah.
yeah.
And
It's
so
powerful,
calming.
very helpful too.
So for people who are watching online, maybe you can hear us or not, but we're talking about how do we help other people help us? And helping our helpers, just simply ask the question, how can I show up for you today? Another way to talk about it is like, do you need solutions or do you need listening? Right? There's lots of different ways to ask the question, right? But to help people journey with us, you know, in ways that are generative. Yes, Jill, you're
There's a question here from Catherine that
okay.
says, what happens when you're stuck in grief for years, and how do you help a loved one, or even yourself grow around it?
Yeah, so I think like I would start asking questions about like what does stuck mean? I think one of the beautiful things about the dual process model is, you know, oscillating between loss orientation and restoration orientation. We're not judging what's happening, but from a clinical standpoint, we do want to pay attention to if you're getting stuck in a certain orientation, right? So if you're not doing the natural observable human process of doing this as you integrate and then, you know, everything, but you're stuck somewhere, then there's different kinds of interventions for different things. So like one of the things that we really look at from a community health standpoint with grief is like you might have heard, some of you might have heard the phrase complicated grief or complex grief or pathological grief. It's an actual condition that needs like psychotherapeutic and intervention and support. And so complicated grief is being basically stuck in a loss orientation. And where we first start assessing for that is that the earliest we can even assess for that is at least 6 months after a loss. Most people kind of like even out a little bit. They'll have these moments, but most people generally even out, you know, within the 90-day to six month mark we see on average. And then you'll have these moments, right? Like the first year anniversary of my dad's death, really terrible. Second year anniversary, sad. We let off a sky lantern and we had his favorite drink and we were good. This year, total wreck, right? Total wreck. But like, that doesn't mean I'm stuck in a loss orientation. It means the wavelength, the oscillation period has gotten longer, right? Start throwing things, sorry, longer and more, and it's kind of evening out. So it's having this thing. So that's if you were stuck, I'd want to learn individually. I'd want to learn more about what that looks like, what's happening, and then give, you know, support as well as interventions and maybe a reference to a mental health professional, depending on where we are. So, yeah.
Can I mention, this may be, Tanya, with you talking about not being able to process your best friend's death. This is gonna bring out all of those wounds
Yes.
as well. So in the grief work we do here at Angry Whispers, we go back and you work on those old unprocessed wounds
Yes.
that are rearing their head now, right? So
Yes.
sometimes you might have grief and you're like, I should be sad, but this is like overwhelming sadness. It doesn't match with what's going on. So we'll go back in your timeline and find out where other moments are. So recognize that some of that grief that you're having right now is not just your dad.
Yes.
Okay?
Yes.
Dealing with an avalanche of
Yeah.
emotions.
Yeah, and I think for me, like, you know, now that I've lost both parents,
That's a
you just,
Yeah.
it's a little, I mean, and I know we all get there, right, but it just, you feel different.
Well,
Mm.
and then your next.
I still had one parent for a while to hang on to.
Yeah.
I don't know if I can explain that.
No, that's real.
Yeah.
Like the access of the earth just goes in and just
Yeah.
changes. Everything looks different, everything feels different.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Imagine what's like.
Yeah, like after I lost my mom, I was so busy, like, taking care of everybody else, I wasn't taking care of
Yeah.
myself at that point, you know?
Yeah.
Sure.
Unresolved grief is
Yeah.
real and it gets deeply pushed in, not because you're trying to do anything wrong. You're just trying to be like, I gotta care for the people who are counting on me, right?
Yeah.
You know, yeah, like I think like in my own grief journey, you know, there have been times where I really want to just give up. And I don't, because this is how like why there's no wrong way and there's no judging of any of it, right? Because like I don't give up because I do have people that I love who are counting on me,
Mhm.
right? And that's a purpose, and that's a valid purpose to keep moving through, that helps me equalize and kind of metabolize my grief and keep going on in my day and not just being, you know, a wreck all the time or something worse, right?
Right, so I
So
process those feelings when I lost
Yeah.
my mom, I had to just step into this automatic,
yeah,
you know, when you talked about that, you know, action oriented, like, it wasn't even a choice for me, I just
Right.
had to do that. And
yeah,
now, like I said, my kids are grown and they're gone, my dad is now passed. And I have this time, so I'm caught between, you know, obviously the executive of the state, trying to go through the state process, but also, you know, in between the doing, finding those moments
Yeah.
of just quietness and not knowing what to do with myself. And
right,
feeling that
that's right,
other part of it.
Yeah.
I didn't experience.
absolutely.
One thing that really helped me and still continues that I have to do, and I talked about it even tonight to Vicky, was recognizing triggers
Hmm.
and knowing how to handle them, and now also knowing how to say, you know what? I know that's gonna trigger me and I don't have the energy to process that today. So
Yeah,
I'm not gonna go to that gathering. I know it's a church gathering.
yes,
But I'll see those people another time, or I'll do this, but I
Yes.
don't have the energy for that today.
yeah,
Because otherwise I would just force myself to do things or no. And when I started to recognize watching a show that my husband and I used to watch together. I couldn't finish the series that we
Mm.
watched, and even though that my kids, I'm like, you guys go ahead and watch it, that's great, I'm gonna get this done or whatever. I knew that would be a trigger for me. 'Cause
Right.
He wasn't sitting in his chair.
Right,
And that's
Right.
not something I wanna process right now. There's so
Right.
much emptiness in other ways. That I'll get there. But if I
Right.
never finish watching that show, then it's not a gap, that's not the hole that needs to be filled.
right, right. And this demonstrates the insanely practical nature of my first grief key, right? Like, you are worthy of your own attention,
Well,
right?
that's hard
Because
to pay
that
attention
is
to.
peak self-care, you know what I mean? Yeah,
It was like, wait a minute, I'm not
And-
gonna let
right.
everything hit me.
That's
I'm
right.
gonna be in charge.
that's right. And then looking for the opposite,
Because
which
we
way,
can't control most
right,
things.
and then looking for the opposite, which I've been learning about, which is glimmers, which are opposites of triggers. Like, what are the things that bring joy and a sense of deep
Exactly.
connectivity? And, like, yes, I miss my loved one, but, I really loved going to McDonald's and getting an order of fries and having a Coke at the end of the day and just eating nasty fries and having a Coke and those conversations. And that brings back good memories for me, right? Those are glimmers,
And then,
So
yeah,
it's like,
good.
recognizing there's both. Everything, I'm a firm believer in that, like, ultimately everything needed will be provided. Everything needed will be provided to you. And it's like, and it's in little ways as well as in big ways. I really believe that. And maybe I know Kathy's feeling very overwhelmed, but I believe that for you. And we all believe that for you. Everything needed will be provided. And it's like, I mean, even in the little ways that really let you know that it's going to be okay. Those are all waiting. Everything is waiting. So
Somebody mentioned the importance of touch. I think you said that. Michelle is a massage therapist and she actually has relief massages. And when I work with people at an eye funeral home, that's the one thing that's often requested, like, do you know somebody? Is there somebody that can do this? Because you will, as you lose somebody that close to you, you realize you don't have the touch anymore.
Mm.
So the massage, she does great massages, but the grief massage that gives you permission to just cry the entire time if you want to, and to release. So recognize when you say everything's provided for you, there really truly are resources, everything.
Mm.
You know, I'm happy to connect you.
Yeah. Any other questions? We'll wrap up maybe a little early.
I just wanna say on the
Great.
glimmer thing, I think it's such a great point, I don't think I've realized I've been feeling it. But I think our dinner, we just laughed and we cried too, but we laughed a lot and told crazy stories about our dad. And even crazy stories about what happened around their death and the funerals and all of those things. One of the things that helped me move from that, intuitive grief into a different space was starting to celebrate my dad and acknowledge him on multiple times a day. In my infertility grief, the thing that helped me move forward was saying, this is never going to be okay. And so everybody can stop telling me it's going to be okay. I will be okay, but this will never be okay. Me not being a mom will never be okay for me. And that freed me of something. I don't know why, I don't exactly know how to explain it, but that freed me. But in my dad's death and the loss of a person, celebrating him helped me to move forward, or acknowledging him during the day. I saw something he liked, like you were talking about the pasta aisle. Well, I stood in front of a stack of better made chips because he liked the better made chips with bushes, and this one is like, you okay? I was like, I'm not.
You're not okay. These are my dad's chips.
So
Yeah.
it's like little moments, even those moments,
Yeah.
acknowledging him and having the moment of crying about it, or acknowledging he would like something. So
Yeah.
that was his favorite food or whatever. So
Yeah.
that helped propel me forward from a place of deep sadness into just a gratitude. Gratitude's huge. A gratitude of his presence in my life.
Gratitude is huge. It is. And, that's another thing like when I'm working with individuals, we'll do we'll do like a 6-week gratitude process where we actually use not only spiritual practices around gratitude and some of the modalities of like whatever your particular faith system may be around gratitude, but also just the clinical research on the way gratitude literally rewires our brains and it creates the relational connection pathways in our brain. So when you connect with people, and this might be a good exercise next time we do something like this, is going to a person you don't even know at the workshop and just say, here's one thing that I'm grateful for. And you just share that. And that literally opens up a pathway in your brain that facilitates interpersonal connection. And what we know too is that when we are elevating our interpersonal connections, right, it literally counteracts the way trauma has restructured your brain. The way pain and grief is literally impacting the anatomical structures of your brain. So it's really amazing when you bring these kind of clinical side practices into our spiritual practices and our health practice, our human core practices, right? Because we know now how to kind of start hacking our brains to help us heal. And it's like fascinating, right? It's fascinating. There's so many different pathways, and those pathways are represented here all the time at Angel Whispers through the different people who provide services here. So, all right. I think that's good. Yes.
You did good.
Give yourselves a hand. You guys were brave and awesome. Steps toward healing. You guys are amazing. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks to everybody online who came. This will be recorded as well. And can we send out the recording to everyone who attended? So we'll send out to the email, on the email to everybody, a recording of this gathering and the digital workbook. And then also a link in that email if you want to set up a free one-to-one session with me. So thanks, everybody.
Yeah, sure, all that information on it.
Yeah, so make sure you did sign in with your name and email information, and that is it. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a great, thank you.
Yep.